Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you and to have Dr. Scissors with us today to talk about these super, super important topics. So as we sit here today, the statistics this morning, about 3 million people tested and confirmed with COVID-19, about a third of those cases, over 1 million cases here in the United States, and so much concern around the world about the global economy. Dr. Scissors, you are an expert in China and India and in global trends. Can you kind of set the stage and tell us from your perspective what is happening today?
Well, let me start with that COVID case number you mentioned, because I think it's way too low, and I think it's way too low in particular because it doesn't include the Chinese contribution properly at all. If you look at the top 50 numbers for cases, you can use an aggregator or you can go to the individual countries. China is the only country that doesn't report tests. I don't mean, there are a lot of countries that don't report enough tests, they report tests badly. China doesn't report them at all. And it reaffirmed that it's not going this week, that it's not going to conduct widespread testing. And what that means as a matter of basic statistics is that the numbers China reports are not comparable to the numbers we report with our now millions of tests that many other countries report. As long as these countries have credible time breakdowns, credible regional breakdowns. That means all the media reports that stack up China, or all projections, including quote scientific, unquote projections based on China, are wrong. This is not arguable. The numbers generated by countries with large amounts of credible testing and the numbers generated by China are different. They're apples and oranges, they can't be compared. So I just would caution everybody listening, when you see this is how China did it, you're getting a false presentation, and this is extremely widespread, including people with a medical background who apparently don't understand basic statistics or don't want to. It's much more arguable how many cases China actually has. I wrote a paper on this, it's short. I estimated 2.9 million a few weeks ago. That number's probably too low. It could be too high, but it's more likely to be too low. Information that's come out since on antibodies in Wuhan, the speed of the global spread, where infections, for example, got to the New York area, how they had to go through Europe first. They all suggest that the number I put out at 2.9 million for China is too low. But of course, if it's 2.9 million instead of the ridiculous 80-some thousand the Chinese report, then we would have a lot more global cases. I also suspect the same thing is true in India, where they are testing, but the testing is very, very sparse. So that's the background on COVID, and we can talk about whatever aspect of the global economy you want to do next, Megan.
So let's talk for a minute about China, since the virus started in China, and we know that there's devastating economic effects, throughout the world. Can you talk a little bit about where the Chinese economy was before COVID?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's obviously debates over this. There's been long-standing fights about the Chinese economy, partly because they report false data. Let's take the unemployment rate. China says in its state media that the official unemployment rate is inaccurate. And if you don't believe me, I can send you the link. There was a brief report from a Chinese securities firm that unemployment was up near 20% right now in China. It was pulled down. I'm not saying that we're right. I'm saying that if you try to say the unemployment rate is considerably higher than the official rate, you get censored. So we had this problem going in of the Chinese don't let you tell the truth about things, unemployment, non-performing loans, and so on. In my view, the Chinese economy was not in trouble in the short term before COVID, but certainly weakening. It's a highly indebted economy. Going into COVID, the debt started with the global financial crisis, that debt acceleration. It's an aging economy. It doesn't have adequate natural resources for its population, and it suppresses innovation in about 20 sectors by saying that those sectors have to be reserved for state monopolies. Other sectors of the economy, China is quite innovative. But when you say there's no competition in these 20 sectors, you're not going to get innovation in those sectors. So land, labor, capital, innovation, China was on weak footing going into COVID in the longer term.
So let's talk about the trajectory of China post-COVID. What are some of the things that you think may occur?
Well, the Chinese were hit about 8 weeks before everyone else. So when the people say they're farther along and closer to recovery, I mean, that's true. We'll be closer to recovery 8 weeks from now than we are now. That's the same thing, logic applies to China. Their April was better than their February, for example, where it's the opposite for us. Nonetheless, April in China would be the first worst economic month by all indications in 11 years if it weren't for February and March. In other words, if we just jumped to April, we would think, oh my goodness, this is terrible. The only reason it looks good is it's better than March, and March itself was better than February. In the first quarter, the Chinese put out a nominal GDP growth number of a little over -3%. But every single one of their nominal figures that they reported was worse than that. And I mean, there's a list of dozens of these, all contracting more, and somehow nominal GDP only contracted 3%. Their real GDP decline was reported in excess of 6%. You put a 1 in front of that and go to -16%, it's closer. I may not be exactly right, but it's better than their number. Even in mid-April, independent work shows the corporate capacity at about, corporations are using about 60% of their capacity. That implies a 40% annualized decline. It's usually in the high 70s. Per capita consumption expenditure fell 12.5% in the first quarter, so you're not getting a lot of help from the household side. This is the worst period of time, really, probably since Tiananmen, when the Chinese voluntarily shut down the economy, and of course, we're much poorer. It's worse, I think, than the global financial crisis. Even though it's getting better, even though China's ahead of the world economy in that respect, it's their worst period probably in 30 years.
So that's going to have some impacts, and we can talk about that later. And I want to encourage everyone listening to use the Q&A feature to ask questions of Dr. Scissors, and you can use the chat feature to talk with your fellow audience members. But for right now, let's pivot to India, right? Because when we look at the global economies, India is always in the mix. Let's ask the same questions about India. Where was India before COVID happened?
I'm going to give a shorter version of the same comment about India. India tests very, very few people per capita. It's like 1 in 1,000 roughly. Maybe closer to 1 in 2,000 still, heading towards 1 in 1,000. There could be a huge number of deaths in India, and we wouldn't know because the population is so large. So let's just get that on background. It's harming the Indian economy in the short term. Before COVID, I had a very pessimistic view of the Indian economy. They failed to reform land and labor markets. Let's just, for background, people know India. India is on the poor side of middle income. They call it middle income, but we wouldn't call it middle income. And it's a middle income designation that the World Bank offers to make countries look better than their actual situation. India was definitely on the poor side of that. Going in, it's very difficult to acquire land to expand your business. The land ownership is contested. If you hire more than 100 or 300 workers, depends on where you are in India, you can't fire them without government permission. And the result is you have a lot of workers flooding in, this demographic expansion that people are aware of in India. So it's soon going to be a larger population than China, but you don't have them moving into productive labor. This is before COVID. The demographic boom is more like what happened in the Arab world, which is a lot of unemployed, unhappy people, than it is what happened in China, where the Chinese were able to find jobs for those people and become the world's factory. So going into COVID, India had failed to take advantage of its demographics with the necessary reforms. On top of that, they had wasted a ton of money propping up growth. And by wasted, I mean government borrowing, mandatory lending through state-owned banks, all while claiming their growth was fine, right? So it wasn't deficit spending to boost the economy as we're seeing around the world now. It was deficit spending at a time when India was saying it was growing very well. So if you don't reform your land market, you don't reform your labor market, you waste money, you're in a lot of trouble heading into the COVID situation.
So what may be some of the things that happened to the Indian economy, the trajectory post-COVID?
Yeah, I mean, one thing where the Indians have a huge advantage over the Chinese is they're being honest about how difficult it is to do economic surveys right now. I mean, you don't want to be sending people out into infected areas. Maybe they're carrying the virus. The Chinese just report like 2 weeks after the term is over, the quarter or the month, and we have an enormous population. But that's fine, survey's done, because they just fake most of the numbers. The Indians are not reporting nearly as much because they can't do the surveys, which is a more honest response. But we do know that they're trying to borrow a lot more money. The financial system is just as bad as it was pre-COVID, which means they're going to waste a huge amount of that. And this is a problem with government borrowing. You can say, we need to borrow this money and it's going to go to the right people. But when you have a bad financial system, it often doesn't go to the right people and it often gets wasted. the same disincentives on labor as before. So if you happen to be in a company in India that like you want to scale up, you can provide food distribution services and so on. You have this disincentive to scale up because if you hire a lot of people, you won't be able to fire them when things return to normal, which we all hope to be as soon. So India doesn't have the flexibility in its labor market. We don't have data, but we know both capital and labor are suffering the same way they suffered before COVID, which means that India's economic response to COVID is going to be very poor.
So one of the things that as a result of COVID and a result of economic interdependence, globalization, is the disruption of supply chains. And we're seeing that in a way that maybe we haven't before. So can you talk a little bit about how the pandemic is affecting global supply chains, especially in relation to the US-China, US-India relationships?
Well, the one everyone's focused on that involves all three countries as well as some others is active pharmaceutical ingredients. And basically that supply chain, it sounds weird to use this language for drugs, but it's just as applicable to drugs as it is for computers. That supply chain has the components, the chemicals made in China. And when you see the really high numbers for China's dominance of the active pharmaceutical ingredient supply chain, it's because of the chemical side. And then a lot of the assembly is done in India. And assembly sounds weird, but it's using the chemicals to actually create the drugs. And then they get shipped to the US, and there are other outlets as well through Europe, for example. But the Chinese have the height of this supply chain. There are a lot of supply chains where we control the heights. In active pharmaceutical ingredients, it's China's dominance of the chemicals industry. So that's where a lot of US dependence on China. Nobody has, and we're hoping we're getting some information on this, but nobody has the drug that properly treats COVID, much less the vaccine, but there are a lot of drugs used in treatment of COVID having to do with sedatives and pain management and boosting people's health independently of the progress of the virus. And most of those rely on chemicals made in China. So we do have a reliance on the active pharmaceutical ingredient side. Then those chemicals go to India. The Indians need the Chinese chemicals to produce. If they don't get them, they don't want to export the final products to us. So then we have another potential bottleneck in India. Outside of that, the Chinese are the kings of global textile production. That's starting to move to Bangladesh and elsewhere. But right now they're still predominant, which means personal protective equipment. They're the leading supplier there. Another item where we really don't want to rely on the Chinese, and there has been a back and forth about they don't want to sell it. They don't want to sell it to us. They'll sell it to other people. They're selling defective equipment. So a lot of issues, primarily, do we want to even have this dependence, but also an execution where the Chinese have put out bad equipment. There are obviously other supply chains. I can go to talk about a couple of them. I don't want to go down the line here. We don't want to spend that much time on it. On the technology side, the big, India is not nearly as important. The big question that the US has with regard to China is whether to look for advanced technology or to re-examine the whole relationship. And if you're looking for advanced technology, what you're saying is high-end semiconductors. We don't want China to move into high-end semiconductors and for the US to rely on China for high-end semiconductors the same way that they've moved into other areas. And because the Chinese heavily subsidize their firms, undercut market pricing, because they steal and coerce the transfer of intellectual property, you can't just hope that it will work out if you're an American policymaker. It hasn't worked out in other areas. It won't work out in sensitive technology either, unless the US takes specific action. So here in Washington, which is where I'm based, you have a lot of consensus that we need to block off high-end technology from the Chinese. Of course, that's easy to say, harder to do, because they're going to be cost the United States. The Chinese are going to retaliate. They're not going to sit there and say, okay, well, you got us on this one. And the retaliation is going to be aimed at firms that are then going to come to the Washington lobby and say, this is a bad time to be hurting us. Please change. That's the easier question. The harder question on the technology side is whether we want to separate ourselves from the Chinese in lower end technology. And the reason is related to the high end. It's that there are a number of important American firms that have heavy shares on heavy weight in the NASDAQ composite, for example, who depend on revenue from China to a large extent. And I can call them out. It's not really necessary. You can look them up easily enough. And those firms claim simultaneously that we cannot separate ourselves from China because they really need that money, but that the Chinese cannot coerce the transfer of more advanced technology from them. And a lot of lawmakers, and me, don't believe this. Don't come to the US government and say, oh my goodness, I have 30–40% of my revenue coming from China. Please do not cause a problem in the US-China relationship. But then simultaneously say, oh, don't worry, the Chinese cannot coerce technology transfer from me, even though I'm revenue dependent on them. So that's a harder question because it's not about something obvious like we need to do something to restrict the Chinese from gaining control of advanced semiconductors the way they have of active pharmaceutical ingredients. The harder question is whether we want to more broadly decouple because of China's leverage over our economy and I hate to say it, our political and social systems as well.
We're going to go to audience questions in a minute. So I want to encourage everyone to, to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit a question for Dr. Scissors. But for just a second, let's talk about how COVID and the new COVID economy we're living in may be impacting trade deals. So we know that the US sort of moved from these big multilateral trade deals to sort of more bilateral negotiation. So what is happening, with the U.S.-China trade deal that was being worked on?
So on as a technical matter, you can just delay the so-called phase one. I say so-called because there's not going to be a phase two. Phase one trade deal between the U.S. and China. You could just delay it for 4 months. Unfortunately, we have to consider the possibility that there'll be a resurgence in the virus in the fall. Even if it, as we all hope, is fading as spring progresses and we get into summer. So it may be longer than 4 months, but the deal itself can just be delayed. I mean, this is what you do in kinds of crisis. You just say, look, we're going to hold to our agreement, but we have to wait a certain amount of time. That's technically true. Politically, it's not really true. The reason that President Trump was so excited about the deal is he wanted to point to expanding U.S. exports and a declining U.S. trade deficit with China before the election. So if you tell him, U.S. takes a while to measure data, not like China. Plus, we're going to have a delay where the Chinese aren't really going to be able to buy U.S. energy products because their economy is weak. Some of the parts of the phase one deal were very difficult in the first place. They're going to be delayed at best. He's not going to have anything to brag about as an accomplishment prior to the election. And that means that his commitment to the phase one deal is weaker. And with all the other strains on the U.S.-China relationship, I think politically the phase one deal is in a lot of trouble. It's not technically in trouble. It can be saved with just a delay and you just have to negotiate the delay. But politically, I think it's in trouble. If I can, there's a larger issue touched on by your question, which we're also dealing with here in Washington, which is we signed an agreement with Mexico and Canada, who are much better trade partners than China. And it was supposed to go into effect this year. And that's a great idea. We should have signed that agreement. We should have open trade with Mexico and Canada, not including immigration necessarily, but in goods and services and capital. But now with COVID, it's not clear that we want to have that kind of open border. So even with partnerships and countries that we do want to have more open trade with, we're not thinking about moving supply chains out of, we want to have a deep trade relationship with, COVID is causing a delay. And it should cause a delay. We need to think about how to do this while maintaining our commitment, while saying to the Mexicans and the Canadians, yes, USMCA, we are absolutely committed. Passed the Congress overwhelmingly. It's a bipartisan achievement, but maybe the implementation should be phased.
So thank you. So a question from the audience about economies emerging from COVID. And what we've been hearing from a lot of experts over the last few weeks is about this great power competition, very specifically the US and China. How do you think those economies are going to merge? I know there's some that say China is, on the rise. What do you see happening in the next, year or 5 years?
So going into COVID, I was unhappy with how much money the US federal government was borrowing for no reason. I just attacked the Indians for this. We were running large deficits for no reason. We had very low interest rates for no reason. The economy was doing fine. It was very short-sighted behavior on the part of the Trump administration, the Congress, Federal Reserve, you name it. It's gotten worse. We have to borrow now, but we should have been borrowing from a state of fiscal responsibility. We now need interest rate cuts, but it's very hard to cut interest rates when we started from such a low level in the first place. So all those warnings that people like me gave about, hey, you know, when you're leveraged for no reason, the time when, and then something comes along, you need to leverage more, you won't be able to. That's exactly what's happened. So the US has put itself in a bad situation. Whenever you borrow a lot of money, you reduce your potential long-term growth. That's what we've done. We've reduced the return on capital. This is where I started with China's COVID cases being incomparable. These are facts. How much we've reduced our long-term growth potential, how much we've reduced the return rate on capital, you can argue about that, but that's what we're doing. And so we're putting ourselves in a bad economic situation. In my view, the Chinese were in a clearly weaker position than the US. They're a much poorer country. Personal income in China is about 1/10 of the United States, so people need to be aware of that. That's personal income, actual money, not GDP per capita, which is an accounting artifact. But the Chinese have not wildly overreacted the way they did in 2009. So in 2009, the Chinese started running up a huge amount of debt. They said they didn't have any economic problems. If that were true, they wildly overreacted. They really hurt their long-term growth, put themselves on course for stagnation. They haven't done that yet. Now, there are a lot of people saying they're about to, a lot of big numbers floating around that China is expected to, but they haven't leveraged further in response to the crisis, or as much as we expected. So if the US is going to hurt itself economically, I'm not saying this isn't necessary. I'm not a doctor and I'm not a public health practitioner or expert. If the US is going to hurt its long-term growth through borrowing now on top of the unnecessary borrowing we were doing before, and China is going to be more responsible, that's an advantage for them. And here's the link between health and economics that's very clear. The more effective your health response is, the less money you have to borrow to lessen the impact on the economy. So we're going to get a set of countries that come out of this doing better because their health response was better. And I don't know enough to say who those countries are, and I think it's too early. I think the fall may tell us who that really is. But if you can borrow less money right now while still protecting your people, you're in better shape. The Chinese look like they're in better shape than us in that particular way. They weren't in better shape going in, but they are in better shape that way. The secondary matter is who's more dependent on the world economy. South Korea is held up as a country doing a great job with regard to COVID. They're very dependent on the world economy though, and if their partners are all suffering, they're going to suffer no matter what they do. And in that respect, the US has an advantage over China because we're less dependent on the world economy than they are. We don't export as much for growth. We don't need to import commodities like food and energy. So there's the policy side where I think the Chinese have an advantage so far. And then there's the basic structural situation where the US continues to have a big advantage over China. With regard to other countries, the Indians, India keeps thinking of this as an opportunity to replace China and global supply chains. They're not capable of doing that. And they're not even close. So I don't see real upside here for India. As I said, the countries that are doing well with regard to health control are, and I don't know who those are exactly, they're the ones who are going to emerge with more capital to deploy and less debt, and they're going to be stronger in 2022 and beyond.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to sort of try and combine a few audience questions here. Do you think that the world will see a decrease in demand for Chinese goods? Do you think you'll see manufacturers moving out of China into other places? Are there alternative sources to China around the world, and where may some of those locations be?
That's a good combination of questions, because the answer of do they want to is yes. There is a problem in transparency in China. It's now cost a lot of lives. It's not going to go away. It's fundamental to the way the Communist Party rules the country. There's a risk going forward of transparency. You also, from the transparency side, you have hostility from your customers around the world towards Chinese products. So firms are all aware of this. They were under pressure to shift supply chains to some extent before. That pressure has increased, but you got to have somewhere to go. And not everyone can stuff into Vietnam, or Mexico. Their combined populations is not small, but it's less than 1/6 combined of China's. You need other options. It would be great if India was an option. It's not. As a whole, maybe particular Indian states could be an option for firms to move. Indonesia, Bangladesh. So firms would like to move. This is not a great time for them to be incurring costs to shift supply chains because they're under so much pressure as it is. And then in the medium term, what you want is to say, I can still have a profitable operation somewhere else. And for some firms in some sectors, okay, it's out there, Vietnam, Mexico, and so on. For other firms, you're just hoping. You're hoping you get better policy from the Philippines, for example, which is a rapidly growing country of 100 million people with unsteady policy, to put it mildly. So the firms, there's a desire to move. There is a fear that customers will not want Chinese products for a variety of reasons, but the options are still limited. And in that sense, like supportive U.S. policy, where we say we trust these countries to supply these products. Those supply chains will remain intact. In fact, they will expand after COVID. That would be helpful. That's an element of U.S. policy where we try to identify countries that we consider to be trustworthy suppliers for various goods.
So we're running out of time, but one last question. So as we look towards recovery and what's coming up in the future, what are some of the most important indicators, globally that we should be following? What should our audience, our communities be paying attention to in terms of the economy, the global economy and resilience?
Oh boy, that's a big sweeping question. Honestly, this is one of those situations where if you're in a hard hit area, there are parts, the urbanization is a factor in the spread of COVID. Weather may be a factor. Tentatively, it seems to be that way. But if you're in a hard hit area and you see people willing to be consumers again, that's a really good sign. And I say that we're very fortunate to live in by far the richest economy in the world, a consumption-led economy. If American consumers in hard-hit areas, normally people look around and they say, well, everything's happening in my neighborhood this way, and you're like, well, that's not the world, forget it. But in this case, if you're an American consumer in a hard-hit area and people are willing to consume again, that's the #1 sign for global recovery, because global recovery is almost always led by American consumption. Because that consumption spreads around the world. The Chinese buy commodities, that's only commodity suppliers. The world growth depends on the supply of US dollars, US willingness to import, and that's going to be determined by when American consumers in areas that really were hurt by COVID, where there's been real tragedy, are willing to say, okay, I'm willing to buy again, I'm willing to go out and buy things. And that will tell you the world is well on its way to recovery.
Derek, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to a time where we can welcome you here in Connecticut in person. But until then, stay safe and well, and everybody out there, stay safe and well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.